Hello, everyone. This is Tom Fox, and I'd like to welcome you to the 200th episode of the FCPA Compliance and Ethics Report. Yes, I'm at my 200th anniversary show, and I would like to thank everyone who has come on board and visited with me and my audience. I have learned quite a bit, and I hope you, the members of the audience, have learned as much as I have. It's been a great run, and I'm looking forward to the next 200. The guest I have today really honors that tradition of having great guests on, and that's Mike Volkov. Mike Volkov is a former DOJer, he's a former big lawyer, and now it has his own firm, the Volkov Law Group. And I thought Mike was uniquely suited to visit with me today about our topic, which is the Yates Memo. Mike comes at it from a prosecutorial perspective, and then talks about some of the practical applications. I take a look at it, of course, from the nuts and bolts end. The episode comes in at just over 30 minutes. I hope you enjoy it. Thanks for listening. Hello, everyone. This episode of the FCPA Compliance and Ethics Report. Today, I'm privileged to have back my good friend and colleague, Mike Volkov of the Volkov Law Group, and we wanted to go deep dive into the Yates Memo. We have both written on it, thought about it, talked about it, and now we wanted to share our thoughts on this podcast. So, Mike, with that, welcome, and thanks for taking the time to visit with me on this.
Oh, Tom, it's always a pleasure. Anytime I get to do a podcast or anything with you, I appreciate it and always enjoy it. Always enjoy it.
Well, Mike, we've both written about this. You, as an ex-AUSA, really came at it, I thought, with a lot of background and perspective. So why don't you share some of the reasons that you think this is going to impact the DOJ's individual prosecutions going forward?
Well, my perspective on this, and there's two perspectives, and I think we can sort of start with the first one, which are in terms of looking with DOJ. You have to look at this, I think, from the Yates Memorandum, taking it at face value and not looking at as a political statement or anything like that. I think that's a dangerous way to sort of minimize what's going on here. But I do think we have to look at it from the perspective of the prosecutors, and then we have to look at it from the perspective of companies that, let's say, face potential, culpability or liability with regard to the FCPA and how they handle it. But let's start first internally within DOJ. Look, I was a prosecutor in the U.S. Attorney's Office in D.C. for, close to 20 years. I also served in DOJ, at sort of a political level during the Bush administration. And I can tell you that when a statement like this comes out, when a policy is adopted, it absolutely filters down to the line AUSA or line prosecutor. And the impact of it, I think, and I tried to write about this in my column, is significant in this respect. Let's say I'm a line prosecutor and you're my supervisor. You're my immediate supervisor. You're my chief of the section that I'm working in. We are both basically evaluated and our work is reviewed, and one of the sort of aspects of that review now is going to be, what did we do to comply with the Yates Memorandum? And the people above us who are looking at the work that we produce are going to say, what did you do to ensure that the Yates Memorandum was followed? And there will be staff meetings at which this will be discussed with all assistants in a room, and they will be told, this is the new policy, and we got to make sure that we do this. And I think for that reason alone, I'm not looking at, what DOJ, the Attorney General, the Deputy Attorney General does or whatever. I'm telling people that down in the trenches, where these cases are actually put together and investigated, there's going to be an increased focus on individual culpability. What I find sort of, and I'd be interested in your thoughts on this, Tom, is what I find sort of perplexing is, hasn't this already been the focus? In other words, weren't prosecutors already looking at this? But I think what they're trying to push is a more formalized structure and direction from the front office to say, this is what we expect you to do in monitoring and reviewing and investigating these cases.
Well, Mike, you said a couple of very interesting things in there. I guess from both your column and your remarks there, the thing that struck me is that in the business world, we call this your incentive, or what you're going to be measured on, which is set out in the Yates Memorandum for a prosecutor and their line supervisor up the chain. The Yates Memo tells them exactly what their senior management would want to measure them on for their success rate. So to me, it seems like you've laid out for the business person, this is the incentives the DOJ prosecutors will have going forward. And as we all know, people will always work towards the incentives and what you're going to be graded on. So I thought that was a really interesting insight you had on that. You know, you started out by caveating your remarks by taking it out of the political context, but I don't think you can really do that because, and I don't say that as a negative because we have seen the DOJ respond to the commentariat, the political commentary about their styles of prosecution and methods of prosecution and overall prosecution directives over the course of the last 4 or 5 years. And I think in part this is a response to some of the criticism that they did go after individuals in the financial institutions. This is really not perhaps FCPA criticism, but there's certainly been some of our colleagues have criticized the department for not prosecuting enough individuals in the FCPA context. So I read this memo as part of a response to that as well.
Well, that I absolutely agree with that. My point is it's absolutely political. And look, the FCPA guidance was politically motivated, but nonetheless, what I'm saying is, even when they're acting in a political way, it has real serious sort of day-to-day impact and changes on the work that everybody does in the department. So, for example, the guidance to me is one of the best documents I've ever seen come from a prosecutor, probably the best from a prosecutor's office. And I tell people that there's so much in there that you can work with. But that had an impact on the line prosecutors in terms of their ability to carry out their job, what their standards were for review, what they wanted to see in compliance programs. It had a lot of impact, but it was political as well. Here, I agree with you completely. Look, I testified in 2010 when Senator Specter, before the Senate Judiciary Committee, when Senator Specter was sitting up there and saying, hey, you guys got a big settlement out of Siemens, but why didn't you charge any individuals? And Specter, who was a former DA and prosecutor, said, we all know that the best way to deter corporate misconduct is to put people in jail, not to get big fines. And I think you raised a really good point, because the supervisor who's going to evaluate me and decide whether or not I get an award or, is now going to not be satisfied just by me coming in and saying, hey, I got a $150 million settlement out of these guys. They're going to look at it and say, okay, you got $100 million, that's fantastic, but here are the 3 individuals we're going to arrest or indict or whatever. And that, you're right, that changes the incentives completely, because if I was a line assistant and I was working in this area, I would make damn sure that I tried to indict as many people as I could, obviously within, ethical boundaries here, to go along with whatever corporate settlement I had. And think of the dynamic, how it's going to change, Tom, where a company comes in and says, we're going to do voluntary disclosure, we're going to do an internal investigation, we're going to do this, and I'm sitting across the table from them, and I'm going to say, let me tell you, you guys have seen the Yates Memorandum. You cannot get the word that's used in there is any cooperation credit unless you bring me all the culpable individuals and tell me why or how I can get them prosecuted. And think about the dynamic changing like that. It's an all or nothing deal And so now the work of the corporate person doing the internal investigation has got to include a whole section or a whole part of the investigation on here are the culpable individuals, here's, we're barred by statute of limitations, or we have this evidentiary problem with regard to them, we have this, that, and the other. And so that changes it changes the dynamic between the companies and DOJ right off the bat. I was troubled by people who have written this off as a political statement and having no substantive impact. I think those people are naive, and I don't think they're helping their clients if they're advising them that way. I would certainly, if you're talking to a company that's thinking of cooperating and, self-disclosing a potential violation, this has changed that calculation in my view. And that gets to my sort of second area, which is companies now have to think a little bit more carefully. They can't just come in and whitewash and say, here's, $5 million penalty, we'll pay it, we cooperated, we brought this to you. Because the question is going to be, well, why aren't we prosecuting the culpable individuals? And I think that changes the dynamic significantly. I see this as ultimately, Tom, we've all talked about the Thompson Memorandum and the McNulty Memo and the impact that had on corporate prosecutions. I see this as just as important as those in the past history of the Justice Department. I think the Yates Memorandum is going to have an impact.
Well, I certainly agree with that. And for those who've not read the Yates Memorandum, the part Mike said about any cooperation to receive any or even to be eligible for any cooperation credit, the word any is double score underlined. And that's in the memo itself. So the department could not have been more clear that to get cooperation credit, you're going to have to bring them individuals. And I guess from my perspective, more kind of on the nuts and bolts of it, here's the issue I see for corporations, Mike. Every investigation I have almost ever done, starting way back when as a young trial lawyer, or using investigations at trial and court cases, the investigator was told the following: report facts, not opinions. Report facts, not opinions. And that was because the company's, the investigation was really a root cause analysis. Typically in the safety world, you want to find out why something happened so you can prevent it from happening again. You are not to assess blame. You were to find the facts. And you could put the lowest shop floor guy, anybody on a witness stand to testify about the facts they reported. And if those were the facts, they can back them up. They can prove your report up. And it was as good as gold in front of a jury. But from the root cause analysis part, that's the dynamic I see changing now, because the department has said, you need to investigate, but the focus is going to be bringing us individuals. And somewhere I even heard the word scalps used. And that's a very different focus of your investigation, of trying to find out why something happened, than we've got to find some individuals to bring them to the Department of Justice.
That's a great point, because look at, for example, I'm sure in some of these cases they didn't. I'm not saying you have to always look at what an individual's conduct is, but you're never thinking in terms of, well, not never, but your focus is not on liability of the individual. Your focus is on, why didn't our internal controls catch this? Right. And, what was deficient in our program, and who was responsible for this, and why it didn't get done. A lot of times, we're looking at systematic breakdowns, and that means we're looking at the system by definition. We're not necessarily looking at the actors in the system, and that's what your point is. And I think that's a real point, because now we're going to have to say, well, not only here's the reason it didn't work, okay? Here's why our gifts, meals, and entertainment, controls were deficient. They didn't do this, they didn't do that, and, requests went this way and money could be taken out that way. Well, now we have to ask another question after that. Okay, given that, who are the actors and what was their intent as they were acting? And, think about, and then that gets to the really, big risk area, which is head in the sand, as we all say, is not a, is a sufficient and adequate intent here. So you could have systematic breakdowns that occur where people are putting their heads in the sand in the face of known risks. And, the Justice Department may expect you to come in and say this person can be prosecuted criminally. And I guess that's a big risk now.
That's a huge risk. That's also a change in investigative focus. And whereas I feel fairly comfortable that I can evaluate systemic failure and even point to the root cause of that systemic failure, I don't feel like I could really investigate intent. So I think you're going to have to retrain investigators. But to your point on intent, I had thought about it in terms of kind of Henry II. Oh, you really need to get your numbers up kind of intent.
Right.
But you're actually even taking it a level further was I don't even want to know what you're doing. And is that intent enough? Certainly it's conscious indifference, but is that enough specific intent to get someone indicted? And now as me sitting in the in-house position directing you to do the investigation, how do I get that information from you and then do I turn that over to the Department of Justice? I have to if I want cooperation credit.
Right. And, look, let's go back. The Bork case, he went to jail for a year because he failed to act in response to 4 red flags.
Right.
He never resolved them. And their case was, here are the 4 red flags, and he didn't do anything. He talked about them and whatever, and he didn't do anything to change them. He went full speed ahead. So he knew he acted with the requisite intent, and they got a great instruction out of the judge that was upheld by the Second Circuit. So, if that's the standard, you also raise another interesting issue, which is, okay, so now when we have investigators going in there, these investigators are going to have to go in like we did as criminal prosecutors in white-collar cases and look for that type of evidence. I'm telling you, in the white-collar world, this intent of the ostrich, putting the head in the sand is, it's unique to the FCPA statute. It's obviously lower in sort of EPA type crimes, but it's a low standard in relation to some of the other statutes relating to fraud or relating to other things, where you can get somebody for failing to act on a criminal basis.
Right.
And that to me, you point another good thing out, which is, I think these investigators, to have credibility with the Justice Department to say, hey, these don't meet criminal standards, have got to have their ducks lined up in a row as to what the evidence is and why it doesn't meet the threshold requirements of the FCPA. So it's going to be, it's going to be a sea change, and I think it'll take time. They're just, I have to take one moment, just the timing of this whole thing is just funny to me, though. In other words, we have the speeches that came out from the DOJ officials. There's a question in my mind, which is, why didn't they do this earlier? After the financial scandals, after the 2010 hearing where Specter was giving them a hard time, why aren't you going after individuals? And they said, well, we're going to go after individuals. Well, if they really wanted to, why didn't they do the Yates Memorandum, or it would have been, the Cole Memorandum, back in 2011? And the timing of this just seems weird, in that it could have been done earlier.
No, unfortunately, my cynical self is going to say it's because Eric Holder hadn't left the DOJ, and they weren't going to do anything formally until they brought in the new AG. Because Holder is stuck with that phrase, too big to jail, for better or worse.
Right.
So, but that gives me a great segue, because there's something else I wanted to visit with you about today, Mike, and that is your column today on GM. Because you tie it into the Yates Memo, and I think you tie it is one of your most passionate columns. you obviously have some very strong feelings on it. Yet you tie it into the Yates Memo and where you criticized the GM settlement, particularly in the context of the Yates Memo being released less than a week before the announcement of this settlement. So,
it was probably one of the worst PR strategies I've ever seen. It shows you that DOJ's right hand doesn't know what its left hand is doing. And so the problem that I have with this is what they did in announcing the GM case, and I am passionate about it because say what you will about the FCPA and putting people in jail for bribery and whatnot, the GM case involved over 100 people being innocent consumers being killed, and being killed because of a device that could have been fixed easily, and there was a sort of a confluence of actors who prevented this from occurring. A senior safety engineer, a senior safety attorney, and other people in the company who were responsible for this. And I'm just perplexed, and I am upset about it because I didn't like the Volkov report when it was done. I thought it was done to prevent senior managers from being held responsible. And then all of a sudden, after all this trumpeting of the Yates Memorandum and things are going to change, the first big case out of the block is a GM case where no individuals were held liable or culpable. And if from Preet Bharara, who I knew and I know very well I worked with him on Capitol Hill when he was Senator Schumer's Judiciary Counsel. He's a smart guy, but when he gets up there and says, well, it's really hard to bring cases against individuals, that to me, that's not what a prosecutor who has a mission says. That prosecutor is going to make a case, and they're going to do it, and there was plenty of grounds here to make a case and to bring a case against individuals who should be held liable. The fact that the company cooperated means to me that there was even more reason because they should have brought them evidence of culpable individuals as well. And I'm pretty upset about it because think about this. Let me go down a couple facts. They paid $900 million. Toyota, which had the accelerator problem, paid $1.2 billion and pled guilty. GM gets a deferred prosecution agreement, okay? And the statement of facts that was put in there was limited to, the focus of it was the last 2 years. This was a 10-year cover-up that occurred. And I don't know who was planning their PR strategy, but if you want to take the wind right out of the Yates Memorandum, if I were on Capitol Hill, I'd bring everybody up for a hearing and saying, what the hell are you guys doing?
Yeah.
So I get worked up about it because I think of the innocent, the victims' families are really upset by this. They're really upset by this, and I can't blame them. If my child was killed or my loved one was killed in one of these accidents, you can rest assured. And by the way, the admission that they made was only as to 15 deaths, and we know that the deaths are over 125.
Right. Because they paid out of the fund that case.
Right. But you see, and DOJ sort of bent over backwards to protect them in their ongoing civil litigation. You know what, Tom? That's not really that. When you're doing a criminal case, my feeling is, I'm not sitting there trying to help the company in civil litigation. My deal is I'm going to judge this case on the basis of a criminal, facts and a prosecution, and you have to deal with whatever the civil implications of that are. I'm not going to bend over backwards to help you in your civil case.
Right.
So I'm sorry I'm on my soapbox about this, but I've written a lot about it, and the facts just get me going. To me, it's one of the worst instances of corporate misconduct that we can also. I mean, it's just as egregious to me as Enron or any of these other major corporate scandal cases.
Right, and just imagine if they had treated Enron like this.
Yeah, that's right. Well, Enron, we're not going to prosecute any individuals, and we're sorry about what happened, and just pay us some money and get back to your fraud scheme.
Right.
And that's what kills me about this. And we were talking earlier, Tom, about I was upset that the general counsel took them, like 6 to 8 months for him to be fired. And that guy should have been fired from day one because he claimed that he didn't know what was going on in this area, which is outrageous since they were settling cases up to that point. Or I believe that he probably did know, but had some deniability or some way to deny. It looked as an old Watergate fan, it looked like the old Watergate scandal to me. Yeah.
Well, and that brings up a really interesting or issue about the difficulty of prosecuting individuals, particularly senior management in a corporation, which is the diffuse decision making that goes on in every corporation. Obviously, you're going to have levels of authority, and whether or not a corporate officer makes a decision at a certain level, do they receive information about that decision if someone else has made it? How does that work into either conscious indifference or active intent? I don't pretend to know the answer to those questions, but it seems to me that we're going down a road that no one's really thought through, and all I can say is it's going to be different going forward.
Well, I think you got to go back to when you're going up the chain in an organization, and there is, somebody made the decision, okay, and that decision was wrong, all right, and then the question is, who did that person tell within the organization, or did they notify anybody above them? And the only way you ever get to the real answer of that is you prosecute, and I hate to say this, but you prosecute the individual who made the decision and then see if they have the information that's worthwhile to cooperate. And if they come in and say, hey, I told the CEO, and here's proof that I told them, and the CEO then claims deniability, then, you're in there to try to build a case. But I don't get the sense that people are building cases in that way, working up an organization. They're almost like looking at what did the internal investigation develop. Well, you know as well as I do that some of the law firms that go in there and, okay, the CEO says, yeah, I didn't know about it. They're not going to spend 100 hours trying to find out if the CEO is lying. So working up the chain and building your case a lot of times is done in the old grand jury way where you bring people in and you squeeze them. And I don't get the sense that internal investigations have the same, impact or efficacy. Now, right. I think what may happen, let's think about it now, is that I may have the incentive as a company to bring the scalp in of that guy who made the decision. And then DOJ will take it from there and say, okay, we're going to call that guy up as lawyer and tell him we're going to indict him, all right, unless he's got something to cooperate and he wants to talk about. And so maybe DOJ, I could see that happening, and that may have a huge impact, Tom. That's my view. If DOJ is going to implement it that way, then where they're going to take the ball to go after some of these people and squeeze them, or if they're just going to rubber stamp the investigation and either give you credit or no credit, I hope it's more the former as opposed to the latter, in terms of doing their job. But I do think there's going to be a real there's going to be a sea change in this area, and who the hell knows, but somebody's got to go back and prosecute those Avon, officials, because that, I'll tell you what, to me, that's still, can you imagine if the Yates Memo was in place at that time when they resolved the Avon case?
Right.
So.
Well, you bring up some really interesting. Yeah, you bring up some great points, but I think we're going to have to save them for another podcast because unfortunately we're at the end of our time. Mike, as always, could I ask if anyone wanted to contact you, how would they do so?
I have a website, which is volkovlaw.com, and then we have can always call me on my cell phone, 240-505-1992, or email me at mvolkov, that's M as in Mary, Volkov, at volkovlaw, all one word, .com. And look forward to hearing from folks and who are really dealing with these issues. Anyways, thanks, Tom. It was terrific. Always great to talk to you, and appreciate the time.
Okay, Mike, thanks a lot, and we'll continue the conversation.
Okay, talk to you later. Have a great
Everyone, this is Tom Fox again. I'd like to thank you for listening to the 200th anniversary episode of my FCPA Compliance and Ethics Report. I have 2 calls to action for you. If you could honor me on my 200th show, if you would rate this podcast in iTunes, I would greatly appreciate it. Also, if you would send me a list of any questions you might have. I'm developing a mailbag episode that I'd like to do at the end of the month. I'd love to be able to talk about your question on the podcast. If you have any questions, you can contact me at tfox@tfoxlaw.com. This is Tom Fox, and thank you very much for listening.